You know, it's kind of interesting walking through cemeteries, and you can read some of the interesting things that they write on the different tombstones. There's one over here that says, "Here lies a lawyer and a good man." They buried two different people in that grave. Now this place is really big. It does remind me of this one guy. He was a bagpipe player, and he played at different funerals, and he was supposed to go way out into the country to this little cemetery, and well, he's trying to find his way and he gets lost. A typical man, he doesn't ask for anyone for directions. So he's way out in the country. He's an hour late now for playing at the funeral. He finally, off in the distance, he sees a couple of guys getting ready to fill in a plot. Oh. He figures, well, you know, I'm late, but I'll tell you what, I'm still gonna go and I'm gonna play my bagpipes. So he gets his bagpipes out and he heads over to where the hole is, and they're just getting ready to fill it in. He looks down at the bottom and he sees the big concrete vault at the bottom already closed off. And he starts playing on his bagpipes, Amazing Grace. Well, the two construction guys, they take their hats off and held them up to their hearts. And you could even see one of them wiping some tears away. And after he plays Amazing Grace, heads back to his car, figures his work there is done. He hears one of the construction workers say to the other, "You know, that's the most touching thing I've ever seen. And I've been putting these septic tanks in for over 20 years. Welcome to session number 4 of our 40 days through the Gospel of John. You know, this week we will be covering the last half of chapter 10, as well as chapters 11, 12, and 13. At chapter 10 and verse 22, John tells us it's the Feast of Dedication. Now that would be Hanukkah. This is feast number 6 out of the 7 that John structures his gospel around. And when we get to the end of chapter number 11, we're finishing the first part, the first half of the Gospel of John. The first 3.5 years have been filling up these 11 chapters. So we begin the second half of the Gospel of John. And in that second half, it's the final week of Jesus, Holy Week, and also his resurrection from the dead. And of course, John tells us a little more of what Jesus did when he rose. So much of what we have from here on out is wrapped up really in the whole concept of death and the grave. Now, 1861, Benjamin Franklin made the statement, "There's 2 things certain in life, death and taxes." Well, that may be true for the most part, but death wasn't a certainty when Jesus was around. Remember, he raised Jairus' daughter from the dead, and he also raised the son of the widow of Nain. And we get here into chapter number 11, and Jesus raises from the dead his friend Lazarus. Now, it was the 4th day, and that's very important. It was the 4th day when Jesus arrived. Now, the reason that he had delayed is because this then made it completely impossible to raise Lazarus from the dead. At least that was the thought that people would have. Because there was a superstition, not a biblical truth, a superstition. A superstition that said that the soul hovers over the body for 3 days, and then on the third day, when corruption sets in, the soul leaves. So after the third day, there's no hope. Not when Jesus is around. You can't say there's no hope when Jesus is on the scene, right? Martha and Mary, they express their grief when Jesus arrives and say, if you had been here, he wouldn't have died. Jesus says to Martha, I'm the resurrection, Martha. I'm the life. And she says, you know, in the last day, I know he's going to be raised. Jesus says, he who believes in me, though he is dead, yet shall he live. Jesus says, I want you to take me to the tomb. And so they go to the tomb together. And Jesus says, roll the stone away. Open up the grave. Martha says, it's the fourth day. He's going to stink by now. And Jesus says, just believe. Jesus then, after they've rolled the stone away, he calls out, Lazarus, come forth. Now, why did he say, Lazarus, come forth? You know, if he just said, come forth, the whole cemetery might have gotten up. Lazarus does come out. They unwrap him of his grave clothes. And what an impact his resurrection has had. Of course, so many people began to believe in Jesus. There were some of those who ran back to tell the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders what Jesus had done in raising Lazarus and the impact that it was having. It was a fourth-day man that he rose from the dead. And this tells us in chapter 11, verse 53, John says, so from that day on, they plotted to kill him. They figured they had to get rid of Jesus. They had to get rid of him one way or another. But something's happening. Jesus is preparing for his own death. They think they're going to kill him, but Jesus, as he says, no one's going to take my life from me. I'm laying it down, and I have the power to lay it down and the power to take it back up again. Then in chapter 12, we experience continued along that theme of the death of Christ. Mary there in Bethany anoints Jesus with fragrant oil. There's objection because of the incredible value that oil had. But Jesus said, don't complain, don't criticize. She's doing this to prepare me for my burial. The next portion of chapter number 12 is the triumphal entry Jesus makes into Jerusalem. Now, the other gospel writers have shared with us about this triumphal entry. John shares a completely different emphasis on the triumphal entry as well. He tells us the reason that so many people were hailing Jesus as Messiah and the crowds were so excited was directly connected to Lazarus being raised from the dead. That's John 12, 17 and 18. So the Jewish leaders, they thought, we might have to kill off Lazarus as well. Little flaw to that plan. He already was dead for 4 days. Jesus rose him from the dead. They kill him off, Jesus might just raise him again. And then we find our way into chapter number 13, where Jesus is then sharing the Passover meal, his final Passover with his disciples. Now, the other gospel writers shared with us the experience of communion that took place there, and how Jesus told them about his sacrifice through his body and his blood. Now, those Gospels were already written, so John shares something completely different with us. Instead of the account of Holy Communion, John instead shares with us Jesus took a towel, girded himself with it, and washed the disciples' feet. Wow. And talked about being a servant. Talked about how we need to serve one another. It's not about being great, it's about being a servant. Now, this really impacted John. Obviously, he wrote about it in his Gospels and shared that. But what Jesus then said after it was something that John carried with him, not just into his life and ministry, but into his future writing as well. Because John shares about Jesus' statements of, I have a new commandment for you. Can he give a new commandment? He's the one who gave the commandments in the first place. Remember, Jesus had already claimed in John 8:58, he was the one in the burning bush who spoke to Moses, the great I am. So yes, Jesus gave the first commandments. So yeah, he can change one. He said, I'm giving you a new commandment. He said, I want you to love one another as I have loved you. Not love your neighbor as yourself, because if you don't love your neighbor, you probably don't have to love yourself very well. And if some of you loved your neighbor the way you love yourself, you would probably be in jail. So Jesus tells them, I want you to love one another the way I have loved you. That really moved John. In fact, as we see in John's other writings, 1 John chapter 4 and verse 7 and 8, the Apostle John says, Beloved, let us love one another. For love is of God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. He that does not love does not know God, for God is love. Yeah, those words really impacted John's life and ministry and writing. And he wanted to make sure that you and I, when we read his gospel, that we would hear those words and they could become a part of our lives as well. And we need that, don't we? We need to know his love. And then we need to love one another. Well, you're going to go into your small groups now. And in your small groups, you can chat about that, about how best can we love one another. Different ways we can express that within our lives. Ways that will please God and impact others. Because as Jesus also said, they'll know that you're my disciples by the love that you have for one another. Thanks for sharing together with me in session number 4. Here in our 40 days through the Gospel of John.